My wife, Emily, and I were on our way to what was supposed to be a make-or-break vacation. It was her idea, really. She had suggested a tropical getaway to rekindle the embers of our marriage after months of strained silences and arguments that started over nothing but escalated into everything. I agreed because deep down I wanted to believe we could save us. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I had tried. The plane ride was uneventful, though Emily's usual charm with strangers felt exaggerated, almost forced. She laughed too loud at the flight attendant's jokes, brushed her hair back in that coquettish way she did when she wanted attention, and I found myself clenching my jaw more than once. I chalked it up to nerves. When we arrived at the resort, a luxurious retreat on a secluded beach, I started to feel a sliver of hope. The ocean was calm, the air smelled like salt and orchids, and the bungalow we checked in had the kind of romantic ambience you see in movies. Maybe, just maybe, this was what we needed. But things started feeling off almost immediately. Emily's phone never seemed to leave her hand. She'd excuse herself to the bathroom and come back with a subtle but noticeable shift in her demeanor, like she'd just been reminded of a private joke I wasn't part of. When I asked her to unplug, to just focus on us, she laughed nervously and said, "Old habits die hard, I guess." Still, I pushed my suspicions aside. I told myself I was paranoid, that I was projecting, until the second night. That's when I saw him. He was tall, tan, and muscular, the kind of guy who looked like he was carved out of marble specifically to ruin marriages. He was standing by the bar, leaning casually against the counter with a mojito in his hand. Emily was sitting a few stools away from him, laughing that same overly loud laugh. Her body was angled just slightly toward him. I froze. He was familiar, though I couldn't place him at first. Then it hit me like a punch to the gut. His face matched a photo I'd seen months ago. A selfie sent to Emily in a moment of stupid weakness on her part. One she had accidentally left open on her phone when she went to shower. It was him, the lover. And he was here. The realization hit me like a rogue wave. Emily had planned this. She brought me here to the same place as him. For what? To flaunt their affair in front of me? To force some twisted confrontation? My heart was pounding, but I stayed frozen, my mind racing for answers. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I sat at a table far enough away to remain unnoticed, but close enough to watch. Emily's body language was unmistakable now. The way she leaned in, flipping her hair, the sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. She was playing the coquette, something I hadn't seen since our early days. Only now it wasn't for me. He didn't seem as into her as she was into him, though. He kept looking around, checking his watch, almost impatient. Maybe he hadn't expected me to be here, or maybe he had, and Emily was improvising. When Emily excused herself and headed toward the restroom, I took my chance. I stood up and approached the bar, sliding into the stool she had vacated. The man noticed me immediately, his confident posture faltering for a brief moment. I made sure to keep my expression neutral. "Nice spot," I said casually, signaling the bartender for a drink. "Yeah, beautiful place," he replied, his voice betraying a slight unease. We exchanged a few pleasantries, small talk about the weather, the resort, the pristine beaches. I didn't let on that I knew who he was, though I could feel the tension radiating off him. It was almost amusing. When Emily returned from the restroom and saw us, her face went pale. For a moment, I thought she might faint, but then, as if flipping a switch, she plastered on her brightest smile and slid back onto her stool. "Hey, honey," she said, her voice too chipper. "I didn't realize you were at the bar." I turned to her, letting a slow smile spread across my face. "Just making friends," I said, motioning to her lover. "This guy seems nice. Do you two know each other?" Her composure cracked for a split second, a micro-expression of panic that she quickly masked. "Oh, no. We just met earlier when I was getting drinks. What a coincidence, right?" Her lie was almost laughable. "Oh, nice to meet you," I said, extending my hand to him. "I'm Daniel, Emily's husband." His face betrayed him. He tried to play it cool, shaking my hand and giving me a tight smile. "I'm Chris," he said. "Pleasure to meet you." The game was on. I wasn't going to storm out or scream at her here. That's what she expected or feared. But I had no intention of letting her or Chris get away with this. No, I would take my time, make them sweat. I would turn their little tropical paradise into a crucible of their own making. "Great to meet you, Chris," I said, clapping him on the back. "Hope we'll see more of you around. This place is perfect for making memories." Emily's hand trembled slightly as she picked up her drink. Chris, for his part, looked like he wanted to evaporate on the spot. As for me, I was just getting started. The next morning, I decided to up the ante. I wasn't going to make this easy for Emily or her lover. If they wanted to play games, I was more than ready to beat them at their own. Emily was acting jittery at breakfast. She barely touched her fruit platter, her fork hovering over her plate like it weighed a ton. "You didn't sleep well," I said, my tone dripping with faux concern. She smiled weakly. "I guess not. Just everything on my mind, you know? Us. Us." I let the word hang in the air. "Good. I'm glad you're thinking about us. That's why we're here, right? To reconnect?" She nodded quickly, her eyes darting to the tablecloth. She wasn't meeting my gaze, and I relished it. I could practically see her mind spinning, trying to gauge whether I had any inkling of her little rendezvous last night. After breakfast, I suggested we spend the day together. Her reaction was predictable. Her face lit up in exaggerated enthusiasm. "Yes, of course. Let's do something fun." "Oh, I have a great idea," I said. "Let's hit the water sports center. Rent a kayak or something. It'll be fun." She hesitated for a split second before agreeing. I knew why. The water sports center was near the bar where Chris had been last night, and she was likely worried about running into him. When we got there, my luck, or rather, their lack of it, played right into my hands. Chris was already there, lounging on a deck chair with a drink in hand. He spotted us immediately, his sunglasses doing little to hide the shock on his face. Emily stiffened beside me, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her tote bag. "Chris," I called out cheerfully, waving at him. "Good to see you again. Small resort, huh?" His discomfort was palpable, but he forced a smile. "Yeah, small world." Emily shot him a quick glance, her expression pleading with him to play along. "You two should join us," I added. "I'm sure Emily would love it." Her eyes snapped to mine, wide with panic. "Oh, I'm sure he has plans," she blurted out. "Right, Chris?" Chris stammered something unintelligible, clearly caught off guard. I smiled inwardly. The cracks were starting to show. "Come on," I said, my voice friendly but firm. "No need to be shy. We're all friends here, right?" Chris looked at Emily, then back at me, clearly unsure what to do. Finally, he muttered, "Sure, why not?" "Perfect." As we paddled out into the open water, I could feel the tension simmering. I made a point to steer the conversation toward relationship talk, lacing my words with subtle jabs. I said, "Emily and I have been married for 6 years. We've had our ups and downs, but we're solid. Right?" Emily's paddle froze mid-stroke for a moment before she forced a tight smile. "Of course. What about you, Chris?" I asked, my tone casual. "Anyone special back home?" He looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. "No, not at the moment." I raised an eyebrow. "Well, you should be careful. You wouldn't want to ruin a good thing if you did." Emily looked like she wanted to throw herself into the ocean. Chris avoided eye contact, focusing intensely on his paddle. By the time we returned to shore, Emily's nerves were shot, and Chris looked ready to bolt. I couldn't have been more pleased. The beauty of it was that I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I was just playing the part of the clueless husband, all while making it crystal clear to them that I was anything but. That evening, Emily was restless. She paced our bungalow as if the walls were closing in, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. I pretended not to notice, lounging on the patio with a glass of wine, watching the waves crash under the moonlight. "Dan," she said finally, her voice tinged with hesitation, "I'm not feeling great. I think I might turn in early." "Really?" I said, feigning concern. "You were fine all day." Maybe it's something you ate. Yeah, maybe, she muttered, not meeting my eyes. I just need to lie down for a bit. Sure, honey, I said. Get some rest. I'll be out here for a while. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she disappeared into the bedroom. A few minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of her phone buzzing. She muffled it quickly, no doubt texting Chris, arranging some late-night rendezvous. I waited 10 minutes before following her. Quietly opening the bedroom door, I found her lying stiffly on the bed, her phone dimly glowing as she typed furiously. When she saw me, she startled like a deer caught in headlights. "Oh, hey," she said, forcing a weak smile. "I was just, texting my mom." "Really?" I said, leaning against the door frame. "At this hour?" She fumbled for an explanation. "Time zones, you know." She wanted to check in. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. Then I stepped closer, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's funny. You think a place like this would be perfect for us to relax, but you seem more stressed than ever." She blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. "What? No, I'm fine. I mean, it's just a lot, you know? Us this trip." "You're right," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's been a lot. But you know what's weird? I've been thinking about what you said back at breakfast, about wanting to work on US. And yet what?" she asked, her voice a bit too sharp. I shrugged, letting the words drip like honey. "And yet you're so distracted, almost like you're here with someone else." Her face turned ashen, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. What are you talking about?" I tilted my head, studying her carefully. "Nothing," I said lightly. "Just an observation. Anyway, I think I'll go for a walk. Clear my head." Before she could respond, I grabbed my jacket and left. But I didn't go far. I circled around the resort, sticking to the shadows, until I reached the secluded path leading to the beach. Sure enough, there they were. Chris was standing under a palm tree, his posture tense, while Emily approached him, her steps hurried. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language was telling enough. She was gesturing frantically, while he kept glancing over his shoulder, clearly nervous. I stayed hidden, watching them for a few minutes before stepping out into the open. "Well, isn't this cozy?" They both jumped, Emily's face a mask of sheer panic. Chris took a step back, as if putting distance between them would somehow absolve him. "Done? What are you doing here?" Emily stammered, her voice high-pitched and trembling. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, keeping my tone even, "but I think we all know the answer to that." Chris opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "Don't bother. I'm not here for a heart-to-heart. I just wanted to see how far you'd go, Emily. And congratulations. You exceeded my expectations." Emily's lip quivered, but she didn't deny it. Chris looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. I took a step closer, letting my words land like punches. "You know what's funny? I came on this trip hoping to save our marriage, to figure out if there was anything worth fighting for. And now I have my answer." I turned to leave, but paused, glancing back at Chris. "Enjoy your vacation, buddy. You're welcome to her." And with that, I walked away, leaving them standing in the shadows. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back at the bungalow, I packed my bag with a steady calm that felt surreal. My hands moved methodically, folding shirts, tucking toiletries into the side pocket, zipping compartments. The storm that had raged inside me since last night was gone. In its place was something colder, sharper, more focused. I had everything I needed to sever the tie that had been choking me for months. Emily returned about an hour later. She hesitated in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. "Dan," she began, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" I didn't bother looking up from my suitcase. "Sure, let's talk." She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. I know what you think you saw, but it's not what it looks like." I let out a sharp laugh, finally turning to face her. "Not what it looks like? Emily, I saw you sneaking off to meet your lover in the middle of the night. You're seriously going to sit there and deny it?" She flinched as if I'd struck her, but then her expression hardened. Chris is just a friend, right? I said, dragging the word out. A friend who just happens to follow you across the world to the same resort where you're vacationing with your husband. A friend who has you sneaking around like a teenager. Sure, Emily. Totally believable. Her face crumpled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean for it to happen. Didn't mean for what to happen, Emily? I asked, my voice cold and measured. The affair? The lies? The fact that you thought I was stupid enough to miss all the signs. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I felt lonely, Dan. You've been so distant. Always working, always preoccupied. Oh, so it's my fault now? I shot back, my voice rising. I was working to keep us afloat, Emily, to give us a life. And this is how you repay me? I didn't plan this, she shouted, her voice breaking. I didn't wake up one day and decide to cheat on you. It just happened. Don't insult me with that crap, I said, stepping closer to her. You made choices, Emily. Every text, every call, every rendezvous, that was a choice. And now you're trying to justify it by blaming me? She sobbed harder, but I felt no sympathy. Not anymore. I had given her everything, my trust, my loyalty, and she had thrown it all away. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady. When we get back, I'm done. You can have Chris or whoever else you've been screwing around with. I don't care anymore. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. No, Dan, please. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just please don't leave me. I shook my head slowly. You had your chance, Emily. You don't get to destroy what we had and then beg me to rebuild it for you. I zipped up my suitcase and slung it over my shoulder. Enjoy the rest of your trip, I said, pausing in the doorway. You can explain this mess to Chris. I'm sure he'll be thrilled. And with that, I walked out, leaving her sobbing on the bed. I didn't know what my life would look like after this, but one thing was clear. It would no longer include her. I didn't stop walking until I was off the resort grounds, my suitcase bumping against my leg with every step. The night air was thick, and the rhythmic crash of waves seemed to mirror the pounding of my heart. I wasn't running away. I was reclaiming my sanity. When I reached the main road, I called a taxi to take me to a small inn I'd noticed on the drive-in. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and quiet. Just what I needed. The driver, a kind older man, made polite small talk, but I barely responded. My mind was buzzing with what had just happened. At the inn, I checked in and collapsed on the stiff bed, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the confrontation with Emily over and over. Her lies, her tears, her desperation. None of it mattered anymore. For the first time in years, I felt an odd sense of relief. The weight of her deceit had been crushing me for so long, and now, even though the truth had cut me open, I was finally free. The next morning, I woke to a string of missed calls and texts from Emily. Most of them were a mix of frantic apologies and hollow promises. I'll fix this. Please come back. I love you, Dan. Don't throw this away. And the one that really set my teeth on edge, it was a mistake. Don't let one mistake ruin everything. One mistake? That's how she framed it? I didn't respond. I couldn't. What was there to say? Instead, I ordered breakfast, booked an earlier flight home, and blocked her number. But as I sat in the quiet of the inn's small dining room, sipping bitter coffee and staring at the tropical foliage outside, I couldn't help but wonder what Chris was doing now. Was he still at the resort, scrambling to figure out his next move? Or had he slithered back to whatever hole he'd crawled out of? Part of me wanted to confront him directly, to demand answers, but I knew it would only give him more power. He didn't deserve another second of my time. Around midday, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Dan, Emily's voice came through, fraught with desperation. Please, just hear me out. How did you get this number? I asked coldly. I borrowed a phone, she said quickly. I had to talk to you. Dan, you don't have to say anything, I interrupted. We're done. I meant what I said. When I get home, I'm contacting a lawyer. Save whatever excuses you have for someone who cares. You can't just throw everything away, she cried, her voice rising. We've been together for years, Dan. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It meant everything to me, I shot back. But clearly, it didn't mean the same to you. Goodbye, Emily. I hung up before she could respond and blocked the new number. It felt final this time, like slamming a door on a chapter of my life that had long since rotted. Later that evening, as I boarded my flight, I allowed myself a small moment of peace. The storm had passed, and now it was time to rebuild. Not with Emily, not with anger or vengeance, just me on my terms. But something told me the chaos she had sown wasn't finished with me yet. Landing back home felt surreal. The familiarity of the city streets, the crisp air, it all should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like I was stepping into a battlefield I hadn't yet surveyed. There was no telling what Emily had planned or how far she would go to twist this narrative. I took a cab to a hotel instead of going home. It wasn't just about avoiding Emily. It was about having space to breathe and think clearly. My mind churned as I unpacked the few things I'd brought back with me. Every moment of the trip replayed in vivid detail. The lies, the confrontation, the sheer audacity of her trying to justify it all. The first thing I did was call a divorce attorney. I explained the situation briefly, and he assured me we'd have a strong case, especially given Emily's infidelity. I scheduled a meeting for later in the week and hung up, feeling a flicker of control returning to my life. By the next morning, my email inbox was flooded with messages from Emily. The subject lines ranged from desperate pleas, please talk to me, to outright attempts at manipulation. We can fix this if you'd just come home. I didn't open a single one, but there was one email that caught my eye. It wasn't from Emily. It was from Chris. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the mouse. What could he possibly have to say? Against my better judgment, I clicked it open. Subject: I'm sorry, Dan, I don't know if you'll read this, but I feel like I owe you an apology. I didn't know she was going to bring you to the same resort. I never meant for you to find out like that. This whole thing got way out of hand, and I want you to know that I never intended to ruin your life. Emily told me things were over between you two, and I was stupid enough to believe her. I'm sorry for my part in all of this. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it. Chris, I stared at the email, my jaw clenched. How predictable. He was trying to absolve himself, pinning it all on Emily, while conveniently ignoring the fact that he'd willingly participated in the betrayal. I didn't reply. I didn't even delete it. I let it sit there, a digital scar, a reminder of how blind I'd been. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings and logistical planning. I instructed my attorney to draft the divorce papers immediately. He recommended gathering any financial documentation and shared assets that might be relevant, which meant I'd have to return to the house sooner than I wanted. When I finally did, it was late in the evening. I hoped Emily wouldn't be there, but as I pulled into the driveway, I saw her car. My stomach sank. I debated leaving, but no. This was my house too, and I wasn't going to cower. The living room lights were on, and I could see her pacing through the window. When I stepped inside, she froze. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair disheveled. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dan, she started, her voice trembling. I didn't think you'd come back. I'm here to get what I need, I said, my tone cold. That's all. She stepped closer, wringing her hands. Please, just let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Emily, I snapped. You cheated. You lied. And now we're done. Her face crumpled, but I didn't let up. You had the audacity to bring your lover on a trip meant to save our marriage. Do you even understand how insane that is? I was confused, she cried. I didn't know how to handle everything. Confused? I barked, my voice rising. No, Emily. Confused is accidentally buying the wrong brand of coffee. What you did was calculated. Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't waver. I moved past her, heading upstairs to grab the documents I needed. She followed, pleading the entire time. Listen, done? I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just don't leave. I stopped at the top of the stairs and turned to face her. It's too late, Emily. You made your choice. Now live with it. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, weeping. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe, but it was fleeting. This wasn't my burden anymore. I gathered what I needed and left without another word. By the time I left the house that night, I felt drained but resolute. Emily's tears, her pleas, they didn't move me. If anything, they only solidified my decision. This was the end. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her. She wasn't the type to let things go quietly. The next morning, my attorney called. "Dan, you might want to brace yourself," he said, his tone unusually grim. "What's going on?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "She's lawyered up, filed a counterclaim, claiming emotional abandonment. She's angling to make you look like the bad guy." I clenched my fists so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Of course she was. I should have seen it coming. "How strong is her case?" "Not very," he said. "But that doesn't mean it won't be messy. She's clearly trying to muddy the waters, probably hoping you'll cave and settle on her terms. She doesn't know who she's dealing with." I muttered. "I want this divorce finalized as soon as possible." "Understood. Just make sure you keep your composure. Any misstep could give her ammunition." I hung up and sat in silence for a long moment. The audacity of her trying to paint herself as the victim was almost laughable. Almost. That day, I began gathering everything I needed to counter her claims. Financial records, text messages, even photos from the trip that hinted at her affair. I forwarded Chris's email to my attorney as well, who assured me it would come in handy if things escalated. Then the twist came. 2 days later, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Chris again. "Chris, you need to know something. Emily's spinning this against you. She told her lawyer you've been emotionally abusive." "She's lying, Dan. I don't want to be involved in this anymore. But I can't stay quiet if she's going to destroy you." I stared at the message, torn between fury and disbelief. Chris wasn't exactly someone I wanted to align with. But if he was willing to expose Emily's lies, I wasn't going to stop him. "Me? Why are you telling me this?" "Chris, because I didn't sign up for this level of chaos. She's throwing you under the bus, and she's trying to drag me into it. I just want to wash my hands of the whole thing." "Me? Then prove it. Send me whatever evidence you have that backs up what you're saying." An hour later, an email came through with screenshots of texts between Emily and Chris. In them, she detailed her plan to make me look like an inattentive, neglectful husband. One message read, "If I can get him to look like he abandoned me emotionally, I can at least come out of this with some dignity." It was both infuriating and validating. I forwarded everything to my attorney immediately. The next move was mine. Armed with Chris's messages and the mountain of evidence I'd already gathered, I requested a formal mediation. My attorney advised me that this was the fastest way to resolve things without dragging it through court. Emily would have to face the facts head on, and I wasn't about to let her dodge accountability. The day of the mediation, I walked into the room feeling oddly calm. Emily was already there, looking pale and frazzled. Her lawyer sat beside her, a polished man with a shark-like demeanor. I took my seat across from them, my own attorney at my side. Emily wouldn't meet my eyes. The mediator began, laying out the ground rules and objectives. I stayed silent as my lawyer presented the evidence. Photos, texts, financial records, and finally, Chris's damning screenshots. With every new piece of evidence, Emily's face crumbled further. By the end, her lawyer looked visibly defeated. "It's clear we're not going to win this," he muttered, scribbling furiously on a notepad. Emily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." I met her gaze, my own voice steady. "You didn't mean for me to find out. That's the only thing you regret." Her lawyer suggested a settlement, and I agreed on my terms. The marriage was over, and I was walking away with my dignity intact. Emily? She had to live with the consequences of her actions. Walking out of the mediation felt like stepping out of a storm into stillness. The weight of Emily's betrayal, the lies, the games, it had all been laid bare, and there was no coming back from it. I'd wonder if you could call it that. But the truth is, there were no winners here, just pieces of a life that would never fit back together. I went home that night to the hotel I'd been staying in. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. No tossing and turning, no waking up in a cold sweat wondering where it all went wrong. It was a strange kind of peace. The next day, I got a call from Chris. I hesitated before picking up, unsure of what he could possibly want now. "Dan," he said when I answered, his voice cautious. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." I didn't respond immediately. What was there to say? You should have thought about that before you got involved with a married woman. "You're right," he admitted. "I messed up, but for what it's worth, I didn't know how far she'd go. I didn't know she was capable of this. Now you do," I said flatly. "Let's leave it at that." "Fair enough," he replied. "Take care of yourself, man." I hung up without another word. Chris's apology didn't mean much to me, but it was a sign that he, too, was done with Emily's chaos. Whatever mess she'd created, she was going to have to clean it up alone. The divorce moved forward quickly after the mediation. Emily's lawyer knew she had no ground to stand on, and the settlement was finalized within weeks. We sold the house, split the assets, and just like that, 6 years of marriage were reduced to paperwork and signatures. Emily sent me a few emails during this time, all of which I ignored. They ranged from heartfelt pleas to angry accusations, as if she couldn't decide whether to guilt me or blame me. None of it mattered. I was done with her. After the dust settled, I found myself in a strange limbo. For years, my life had revolved around Emily, her needs, her moods, her betrayals. Now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. Free to make my own choices, free to start over. I took some time off work and went on a solo trip, not to a tropical resort. Those places were tainted for me now, but to a cabin in the mountains where the air was crisp and the silence was soothing. I spent my days hiking, reading, and reflecting on how I'd let my life spiral so far out of my control. It was there, in the stillness of the mountains, that I started to rebuild. Not the life I'd had with Emily, but something new, something better. Months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Emily had tried to rekindle things with Chris, but it didn't last. Apparently, he wasn't interested in carrying the weight of her drama. I wasn't surprised. People like Emily always burn the bridges they cross. As for me, I'm doing okay. More than okay. Actually, I've reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with, started new hobbies, and even gone on a few dates. Trusting someone again will take time, but I'm not in a rush. Life is quieter now, simpler. And for the first time in a long time, I'm the one in control of it.